The biggest social issue today, the crux of all our issues, the thing plaguing the 99% in America truly isn't racism, but is really classism. Classism, especially cloaked as not only overt and systematic racism, but casual, everyday acts of racial prejudice and intolerance. We as a people have been fed the line for a century and a half of racism being done away with and slavery being a long such remnant of the past. But that isn't true. They've used this lie to allow them to fill their pockets without anyone batting an eye. They gave up people for the general racist white population looked down upon, so in the words of LBJ, who quote, empty his pockets for you. Even those of us with good intentions have been fed so much propaganda and lies over the course of our entire life that we innately have this fear of black and brown people. Middle America convinced Mexicans crossing the border would take their jobs, convinced black and brown people are all lazy subhumans who are all drug addicts trying to take their jobs. They've made us convinced the people below us are the threat. They'll take our jobs away if we don't work at absolute capacity. When the real enemy, the real devil, is one above us, the capitalist. He's the real devil that is putting us in this position where we need to work till our bodies give out day in, day out, because they want to break us. They want people to be unemployed and desperate to drive down wages and treat us as poorly as possible. The only limits being the law. The larger reservoir of desperate, unemployed people is infinitely easier to exploit workers for minimum wage, holding the fear over their heads that if they don't work at maximum capacity, they'll lose their livelihood. That's why they portrayed the them as so evil and subhuman. It's to not only make it more excusable and acceptable to exploit and kill them, but make them look like the enemy, to direct the attention away from the real evil. Most importantly, make them so detached and separate from us that we ourselves would even want to kill, imprison, and ostracize them ourselves. If we didn't have this enemy looked down upon, so many of us wouldn't be blind to the very blatant few owning all the power, all the money, to the fact as few as 8 people own as much as half of the population of the planet. Really think about that. 8. An amount of people less than the number of fingers on both hands own as much as, if not more than, over 3.5 billion people. The uber rich have used this racial division to not only fund everything, but to make it easier and more acceptable to exploit these people by painting them all as rapists and murderers. All Mexicans, all blacks. Even convinced their own people to hate them. They called them super predators, criminals, drug dealers, when they're the very ones who perpetrated. They even admitted the war on drugs was the war on black people and the left. One of Nixon's chief political aides said it in 94 with the quote of, well, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Let not be misconstrued, however. My enemy, and the real enemy for us all, is not the white man we see, not the kid down the street, but it's the white man we don't see. We are all in this together. They're trying to make a divide between us. That's why they murdered the founder of the Rainbow Coalition, Fred Hampton. The FBI themselves knew how big of an issue was, not directly saying his name, but he is the one who fit every criteria of the so-called Black Messiah. The government and the police assassinated him because they knew he was someone who could have united us all in the 60s. They murdered my hero because he spoke truth to power. They murdered him because instead of separating people like Malcolm did or being strictly peaceful like Martin, he united people of every race, of every creed to protect themselves and fight for change. They murdered him. The United States government knew that a smart black man who can unite the people is the biggest enemy to their way of life. Because if he continued to live his life and continued to spread the message of inclusivity and solidarity instead of hatred and racism, there's no way we'd ever allow them to continue to push this genocidal consensus. Fred, and by proxy as a child of his revolution, I understand that impactful change is impossible without help from everyone else who lives in the valley. White people are not the problem. We need them, you, to join us, because we are all one and the same. We're all under the thumb of the evil capitalists making all the real money. We as a culture need to understand that we all live in the same place. We are all in the valley. Black, white, brown, yellow, green. We are all one and the same. So why would we try and kick our brothers and sisters in the same little boat as us? And the real oppressor of us all is the people up on the mountaintop. That devil is playing king while we the people sweat and do the work that makes him rich. Barely making enough just to live and spending most of our lives doing work we hate. It's not a question of black or white. It's so much bigger than that. So if we're going to allow these primarily white devils to work us to literal death, imprisoned our brothers and fathers for drugs they delivered over military planes, with legislation funded by private companies training the lives of generations of black and brown people for money. The rhetoric used by these racist white woes hasn't even changed in a century and a half. The line of, "it happened forever ago," has been used since 1883. Even the Supreme Court used this argument to strike down positive change when they said, quote, "when a man has emerged from slavery and, by the aid of beneficent legislation, has shaken off the inseparable concubines of that state, there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of a mere citizen and ceases to be the special favorite of the laws, and when his rights as a citizen or a man are to be protected in the ordinary modes which other men's rights are protected." End quote. Less than 20 years after slavery was quote-unquote abolished, they said it's been forever. And slavery wasn't even illegal till the 40s. Yes, you heard me correctly. Slavery in the United States of America wasn't made a punishable offense until 1942, when FDR passed legislation during World War II. For context, the Civil War ended in 1865. World War II started before slavery was illegal in America, the so-called land of the free. The name of the last slave was Alfred Irving, a man held in servitude not under neo-slave titles, but literal slavery. He was called a slave in the newspaper when the FBI raided the farm he was forced in. Slavery, under the literal name of slavery, has been illegal in the United States for less than 85 years. Cars, planes, helicopters, air conditioning, jet engines, electron microscopes, color television, and the first electronic digital computers have all been around longer than the ability to convict someone of holding a human being in slavery in the United States of America. This whole country is built on free labor, yet continues to refuse reparations, aka giving the money to the people actually doing the work. Sound familiar? Under the structure of capitalism, is slavery really gone? Are we really free if we are forced to live most of our lives making other people rich while hating our lives? You may be allowed to take off a week over the course of a year, but you have to work. If you don't do this thing, statistically over half of you hate. Are you really truly free to live your life when most of us spend in this servitude barely making enough to live? Because what is freedom to you? Is it spending only a third of your life doing what you would really enjoy? Or is it just free enough that we don't try and fight back and uproot it all? I'd estimate at least 60, if not closer to 90% of us are in this system, this loop of being a slave to the system. This is why capitalism is so evil, why the country and why the capitalists at the very top are so corrupt. They are allowed to subject hundreds of millions of people into hating their lives just for the profit of themselves and maybe 5 other people at the top. There's not enough time in a year at minimum wage to match the exorbitant amounts these CEOs are making in a day. The argument of people just needing to work harder is pure bogus. They are the people who are truly free. We aren't. And this is why a revolution is needed. You don't fight white capitalism with black capitalism. You fight it with socialism. You fight fire with water. What even is the government for anyways? Is it here to help make a few people rich or make the vast majority have a good life? This is why they only teach a very sugar-coated white nationalist history about Martin and paint Malcolm as an evil fool. We need to be willing to protect ourselves. We need to be willing to meet violence with violence because it's the only language they understand. We can't try and communicate to them with peace talks because it simply doesn't work. We try to change their minds by speaking a language they don't understand. They're violent in the Middle East. They're violent in Cuba. They're violent in Russia. They're violent all over the world, and especially in their own home. You can't get through to a man without speaking the language he understands. You don't speak Chinese to a man who speaks Russian. You don't speak Swahili to a man who speaks French. So we have to meet their violence with violence from ourselves. This isn't to say that we should go out and kill random police, especially not our white brothers and sisters. Also, since we don't have the freedom like they do to do that, we need to protect ourselves, like the Panthers. That's why they killed and imprisoned its leaders, passed legislation to subdue them, and painted them as, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. It's because the Panthers did work to protect us and help the poor, especially in Hampton. They were a socialist group, and we all know the state has always been terrified of anything socialist. This fear comes to the fact that they know capitalism is evil and wrong, but don't care because it makes it easier for a few people to become filthy rich. They know it's wrong and have known for a long time. It's why they've either completely neglected the education system or during the era of the Bushes, especially, made it even worse. Because if you can keep the children dumb, then you never even have to worry about the adults. They feed these false narratives about our homelands, especially Mexico and Africa, because they know that we are their biggest threat to their way of life. Like I've said before, the FBI admitted it because they need the work of these people they don't see as people to build their empires. They make us hate our roots, and more than that, they've poisoned it for the reasons I see as twofold. The biggest reason is so that we associate ourselves with those only presented as illegals or apes or criminals. By the time we reach even teenage years, we start to see ourselves as poor, uncivilized drug addicts whom we should loathe and fear, as well as normalizing this and making it seem as though it's our natural state. They fed into this narrative further by filling our streets with drugs, colonizing our homes, so that we remain poor and in need of help. It's all this elaborate game so we subconsciously hate our darker skin, our differently shaped eyes, noses, and lips. The second part of this narrative is to make it seem like the States is a utopia for darker skinned people. Like we should be thankful the white man has saved us when he's the one who enslaved us, when he's the one who made our homes so poor, when he's the one who forced us into these ghettos with no funding or ways to ever leave. These racist institutions have made us hate our roots over the last 3, but especially the last century, so we innately hate ourselves. So we'll hate the tree without even realizing it. First they called us slurs in the news. First we were hard-R's, wetbacks, N-words. Then we were super predators, blacks, border jumpers, to now we're criminals, rapists, junkies. The technical words may have changed, but the intentions haven't. And the reasons they haven't changed in the last 60 years, maybe even getting worse with the president quite literally calling us rapists and murderers, not painting a distinction between us and the people, and the very worst of our community. They make it seem, and have been making it seem, like we're the same as the very worst parts of our community so blatantly and obviously. It's all about getting more abstract. The political strategists behind Reagan and Bush the second, as well as the chairman of the Republican National Committee, said it all in 1981 when he said, quote, "You start out in 1954 by saying harder, harder, harder. In 1968, you can't say harder. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes and all these things we're talking about. They're totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. You want to cut this is so much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than harder, harder. Not only has their rhetoric stayed nearly the exact same, but their actions have too. Not only just instead of slavery, we have forms of neo-slavery, but we have Jim Crow laws almost fully back in the form of the felon title, stripping people of their rights for things as small as a tenth of a pound of cannabis. In my opinion, lynches are barely even gone. White supremacy, and in essence the Klan too, is barely even gone. It's just been replaced by the police, who've taken an even more militaristic approach to quote-unquote law enforcement. Honestly, it's gotten worse, if anything, in the last few years because of what I've coined the birth of a nation effect. This term, which can be summarized by understanding how the Ku Klux Klan came back to prominence in the 1920s, happened namely from the film back to prominence. Namely, the film by the very name helps a lot to understand why we keep taking one step forward and 2 steps back. It portrayed the Klan as heroes. Honestly, it's gotten worse, if anything, in the last few years because of what I've coined the birth of a nation effect. This term, which can be summarized by understanding how the Ku Klux Klan came back to prominence in the 1920s, or namely the film by the very name helps a lot to understand why we keep taking 1 step forward and 2 steps back. It portrayed the Klan as heroes, martyrs, saviors for the white population after the 13th Amendment and supposed emancipation of the slaves. This film rewrote history, and in doing so made it socially acceptable for people to be even more outwardly racist and cruel. It is the same thing politicians, and especially conservative ones, have been doing for centuries. Reagan and Nixon both did this immensely, but Trump took it to a whole new level. He made it acceptable to call all Mexicans rapists, all Mexicans criminals, and only assume some are good people. No, this is wrong. It's wrong for anyone to do, and especially for a presidential candidate, and tenfold bad for a president to say. The absurd thing people don't seem to understand is it's not just anyone saying these things. It's the president. The president can't say these things for obvious reasons. If the most powerful person in the country can have no real repercussions, then what stops the average racist white supremacist from saying it himself? He and others before him gave racists our permission to overtly show their disdain and outright hate of darker-skinned people. The capitalist plan has worked even better than they could have ever imagined with Trump. Not only did he portray himself as an outsider to make uneducated whites love him, because he truly is just another of the capitalists in control, he could push legislation to benefit rich people, such as his added tax cuts to the rich, as if Reagan's trickle-down economics hadn't failed already. Having one of these kinds of men in power, he also knew to create tension between the races, especially the most financially kneecapped of them all, namely Mexicans and black people. It all goes back to the past. They just recycle the previously used tactics. History just repeats itself. There's a reason we don't learn about it in schools. The rich and conservatives use the tactics mastered by Reagan, Nixon, and Bush and Atwater to keep on funneling money to those already most powerful and wealthy. They'll even sometimes, quote unquote, join our movements to kill them from the inside. It's all just a game to the rich and powerful. Our social movements are nothing more than tactics to win elections, secure votes, and appear as though they care about our causes. A great example of this is when Mayor Bowser, the District of Columbia, did a prime example of virtue signaling with her BLM mural in Washington, D.C. She portrayed herself in the media and to the general public as an ally to the cause, without needing to actually enact any change. Appearances are everything for politicians, Democrat and Republican. Bowser is a Democrat after all, using essentially the same tactics as Reagan and Trump. They all pretend to be one thing while being in fact another. There's no difference between appearing to be an outsider to appease the racists who gets ostracized, or appearing to be an activist to appease the liberals while sterilizing the change we're fighting for. Capitalism, conservatism, and white supremacy are the very building blocks of which we as a country are built upon. You can't have an even field of a country when it was built on the exploited, broken bones of black and brown people. While slavery was made illegal a little over 80 years ago, redlining, the war on drugs, coupled with the mass incarceration of black and brown people, have made it nearly impossible for us to compete. And when we do bootstrap ourselves, well, look at what happened at Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 from May 31st to June 1st. This is why we need to unify. However, change can't happen if we just work. History has proven time and time again it doesn't work. The government and other people won't allow it. We need to rebuild the Rainbow Coalition and restructure the government, have a revolution, and build it from the bottom up. Racism and classism is so deeply entwined with our whole system, and we need to fight together to change our nation. We are in the valley. They are on the mountaintop. It's time for us to look at the real oppressor. Now, I want you all to put your fists up in the air and repeat after me. We say all power to all people. We say white power to white people, brown power to brown people, yellow power to yellow people, black power to black people, X power to those who we left out. Thank you.